Hello everyone. Today we are going to look at building custom FortiSOAR connectors and how to use them in playbooks. Let's say for a use case where you want to have a custom enrichment for IP URLs and domains. You have an endpoint specific to your organization that aggregates reputations of indicators or observables across multiple sites and then creates a consolidated reputation. And you want to build a FortiSOAR integration that can query that endpoint and get the reputation or enrichment for a given IP domain or URL that an analyst can use for further investigation in the SOAR platform. So let's get started. FortiSOAR offers a first-class user interface for building your own connector solution packs and widgets. We're going to look at building a custom connector. Let me give my connector a name called custom enrichment, since this is querying my custom endpoint for enrichment of indicators. This is the first version of my connector. I'm giving my name as the publisher. Okay, so there are some predefined templates for uh, connectors that can give you a skeleton for building your own code on top of it. So I'm going to select sample REST integration because I have to query a REST endpoint via my integration. Hit save and continue. This page gives you the configuration option for the connector. So since we are going to query a REST-based endpoint, this list is auto-populated with fields that are typically used in a REST integration. So there is a server IP port on which the web server is running, and there is a username password to connect to it. Protocol, whether it is on HTTP or HTTPS, and for HTTPS, do you want to verify the SSL connection or not? You can remove any of these that are not applicable. For example, if the endpoint is on the intranet and not authenticated, you can remove the username and password arguments. Similarly, if you want to add something, say for example, um, okay, so maybe you have a custom field called a custom tenant, if it is, or let's call it org, if there are org specific databases. I'm going to keep it not required. Default value, let's keep it as all. And let's add this field that got added to our list of configuration inputs. So the next step is to add actions onto this integration. Since we've chosen a REST-based template, it has given us the standard get, put, post, and delete operations for any REST endpoint. So since for our enrichment, we are only going to do a get call, let's remove the others and build upon the get API call template. So I'm going to add this, rename this basically to get domain reputation. Category, that is optional, but since this is mostly used in the investigation phase, I'm going to call it investigation. The description would be get reputation for a specified domain. As for the inputs to this, let me remove the default one, and I'm going to add an input called domain because I need to get the reputation for a domain. It generates the field name as all lowercase domain. The field is editable. It will be a required field because that's the only user input for this action. There is no default value. It will be for the specified for the user provided domain. And tooltip if we want to add. Okay, so that's added. Similarly, you can add more parameters if needed to your action, or you can add more actions. So like in our integration, we would also need a get IP reputation, get URL app reputation actions. For the demo, I'm going to limit it to just one action, and that creates the skeleton for us to work upon. It has generated the information file called the info.json, which with all the information that I supplied you in the wizard, the metadata, the configuration, and the actions that I want to add to the integration. You can look at the JSON view for the same. This is a key value pair of the user of the values that we supplied. The configuration inputs, and then the operations. So this is more like a notes, and then the key value pairs that describe the operation. So the operation name was get domain reputation. Let me change the keyword also from the sample to a more meaningful name that in context of my integration. So I'm going to call it get domain reputation and save these changes. The requirements.txt file is where we specify any external Python dependencies that my integration would need. Connector.py is the landing point for any integration or connector. This seems to be something not required from the templates. I'm going to remove that. Let me rename this to something specific to my connector. Whenever I call a health check for the connector, this is the function that gets called. And for any other operation, this is the function, the execute function of the connector gets invoked. So I have renamed the connector to match to my connector's name. Builtins.py is an auto-generated um, file that basically contains a list of all the actions defined in the connector. Utils.py is a utility file which has helper functions to invoke a REST endpoint because we selected a REST-based template. Constants. Okay, so this is how my connector logs will start. So let me again rename this to match my connector name. Healthcheck.py is the file that holds the health check function. So it is invoking an endpoint. So by default, the default template is invoking a /auth URL endpoint on the URL that I specify in the integration, and it is going to call it via a post method. I don't need the delete and post for my integrations. I'm just going to remove those. And the last file called get domain reputation is where I need to add my uh, code to invoke the REST endpoint and get the reputation for a specified domain. So let me try to get the input from the user from the inputs to the action. As you can see from here that the parameter, the input to this action get domain reputation had a value of domain. So I am going to get the domain like this, and then I can use the same utility function that was defined here to invoke the REST endpoint. So let me just copy some sample code from here and use it in the get domain reputation function as well. Okay, so let's say my endpoint is called get domain reputation, and it gives me a response, and that's the response that I want to return from this function. Okay, so now my connector is ready for use. I can test this connector by providing a dummy configuration and then testing my action. So since I do not actually have an endpoint where I can query for auth and custom reputation, let me just comment out this code for my test. And also here, let me just return a mock response. And I am just returning a hard-coded JSON. Say, for example, for any domain, my response would look like reputation suspicious, maybe. And I want to give it a score of something between 50 and 75 that could typically map to a suspicious reputation. Okay, so that's a test response that I can return from my connector and validate. Okay, now let's validate if the code has any issues. So I am going to give custom endpoint.com and user just some dummy values here. Okay, and it says my connector is available because, as you would notice, I have commented out the actual REST call and returned a hard-coded value here. But if I actually have an endpoint that can serve this request, I could directly test that as well from here. Now let's test this action as well. Give it fortinet.com and select the config that I just added and say execute. So now you can compare it with the output that I have here. I gave a reputation of suspicious and a score of 65, which maps to the output that I see. Now let's give it a few more combinations. Let's actually try to use the domain input that we got as an action input. So let me just say that if domain equals fortinet.com, I'm going to return a reputation of good, a score of say 10. And actually, let's also return a confidence value in the reputation that there is a confidence of 90. Else, I want to return okay. So let's save this and again test the reputation for fortinet.com and the specified configuration. Perfect. So we get a reputation of good, a score of 10, and a confidence of 90. Now let's run this again for some abc.com and it should reach our else path here. Sorry for the configuration and then execute. And it comes to the else path. So this is an example of how we use the domain, the parameters from the action input in the code. Okay, now before I publish, let me just make the output similar in both the cases and save. Just a quick test again. Perfect. So our unit testing is done and we can go ahead and publish this connector to be used in our playbooks. So, okay. So our connector is now available in the list of connectors installed in my environment, and I can start using them in our playbooks. As a next step, let's see how we can use this connector to enrich indicators that are created in the environment. So let me just go to our indicators and see what happens when we uh, and try to enrich a, a given indicator, the default flow for enrichment. So let me just add something. Let me add fortinet.com, the same domain that we were testing with. As soon as an indicator is created, it goes into an auto enrichment. There is a progress bar that gets displayed, and it goes away whenever there is a reputation available. So we have in this environment a few enrichment sources configured. There is Fortinet Web Filter Lookup, there is Fortinet FortiGuard Threat Intelligence, there is IP Stack, and there is Virus Total. So my connector is, my integration is automatically enriched from all these sources, and the information from each one of them is displayed in a nice, friendly user interface for my review and subsequent action, or for any alert where a sighting for this domain has been. So now, if I want to add to the integration that I just created, if I want to add to the same list, what are the steps to do that? Let's look at that. To start debugging that, let's actually go to the playbook that ran on this indicator as soon as this got created. So I can see two playbooks that ran. One was to compute an alert priority. Whenever an indicator is created, it tries to look up which alerts it was linked to and recompute their priority. The other one was the playbook that interests us at the moment, which is the enrich indicator playbook. If you go to our solution pack documentation, you will see that it gives some information about how we can extend the indicator enrichment flow that comes by default with the FortiSOAR playbooks. So it says that the enrichment process looks for playbooks tagged with some specific tags, such as for URL, it looks for URL underscore enrichment. For IP, it would look at IP enrichment and so on. So it looks for playbooks with those tags. It ensures that these playbooks, the connectors that these playbooks are coming from, have been configured. Then it holds all of that in this entire list into a global variable construct so that it doesn't have to recompute every time it has to enrich. And then it begins the enrichment, and each of those enrichments returns certain fields, some predefined attributes called the CTI name, CTI score, verdict, source data, field mapping, and enrichment summary. Now, each of these have a significance. Let's actually go back to the playbook that we were looking at and see if the process listed out here maps to what actually is running in our playbook. So here is the playbook. It started on create of the indicator. So the trigger point is on create. It checks if it's a multi-tenant environment, and if it is a multi-tenant environment, it would fall back to the tenant node to do the enrichment, but here it wasn't, so it started enrichment at the node where the indicator was created. Now, in order to look at these steps, let's actually go back to the playbook itself instead of looking at its execution log. So okay, so here is our playbook. In the configuration step, it has defined certain inputs like what are the color codes to use for good, malicious, the different kinds of reputations. Basically, it has tried to provide all the user inputs at one place. So if at all you wish to customize anything in the overall flow, this is where you need to do any changes. So this are the color codes, and then it tries to create it tries to take the indicator IRI, whether it is coming from the manual trigger or if you're calling this playbook with an input parameter, it tries to, both the options are possible, and at this step it is trying to consolidate both the flows into a single variable. Then it has some other constants, like if it is trying to check if this playbook is being referenced from somewhere or if it has been directly called as a manual trigger. It needs just to evaluate whether um, it needs to return a response directly to the calling playbook, or it can update the description of the indicator. Like when we saw here, it had updated the description itself. So that's the check it is doing here. And then it has defined certain constants, that what are the tags it needs to look for. If it is a file-based indicator, if it's a URL indicator, then it will look for URL enrichment tags on the playbook. So that mapping here, in case you have introduced a custom indicator type, and this is where you need to change, where you need to define the tags for the corresponding indicator type. So that's the configuration. Then it is starting the enrichment process. So it starts with first changing uh, the enrichment status of the given indicator as in process, and that's how we started seeing that progress bar on the indicator that said that the enrichment is in progress. So, and then it looks up what all playbooks it has to run for this given indicator. So it is trying to basically identify the type of the indicator, and from the indicator type, it is trying to find the corresponding tag based on the map that we had seen in the configuration step. And then what would be the corresponding tag, the global variable that it needs to look up. After that, it checks if it has found an indicator that can be enriched by these playbooks. So basically, it has found something that maps to one of these values as the indicator type, so that it knows what tag and what playbooks to look up for. Once it has seen that it is a supported indicator type, it will get all those playbooks that can be run for it, and then it uh, basically finds goes to get the reputation. For type IP, it does some additional checks, whether it's an internal IP from the intranet or a public IP, etc., so that it can optimize some of the flows. From both of these, it gets the reputation, then it goes to compute and aggregation. So it sees that from all the sources, what is the verdict? It joins them. What are the CTI names from the CTI score? It basically creates an aggregation across these different sources of all this data, and keeps it ready. This is basically all the data transformation that is happening in this step. And then if based on the verdict, if it basically checks if it is malicious or not, and based on the verdict, it will set the reputation of the indicator, the value of the pick list. Basically, it will find the corresponding pick list ID and a string text denoting the final reputation verdict for the indicator. And then if it checks whether it was a reference playbook, yes, then it will just return the result. If it is directly triggered, it is going to update the indicator record with the values identified from the compute reputation data step. It is going to update the source data for the integration, the reputation value, the description with all the information that it has got from the different sources. So that's the overall flow for enrichment. And in order to plug in our custom connector into this flow, let's also look at so this is basically where it is trying to find these playbooks and run them one by one. And of course, it tries to find them via looking up those playbooks with these tags that were outlined in the document that we see here. Okay, so to make that clearer, let me actually open a sample integration where we have an integration where this pluggable enrichment framework is already implemented, and the source provides a reputation. For example, let's look at our IP stack integration. So, and since we are doing domain reputation, let's look at the playbook that gives the domain reputation for IP stack. Let me clone it, and I will actually create a collection for our integration that we just wrote, and we will copy this playbook over to our new collection and make the necessary changes there. So that's our new collection, and we copy this playbook, the playbook that we just cloned. We will move this to our integration. Now let's go to our collection, and here is the base that we have to work upon and customize it as per our integration. Let me call this custom enrichment for domain. It needs this tag called domain reputation, domain enrichment, because that's how this playbook will be picked up for enrichment of this indicators. So let's now look at where all we need to do changes. So the starting point is a reference playbook, no changes required there. Use mock output. This is a flag that all FortiSOAR playbooks can use to switch on and off. So whenever we set this value to true, any subsequent connector steps in the playbook, or any step in the playbook for that matter, will not do an actual invocation. Instead, it will just return the mock output that gets defined here. So if you look at most of our steps, you can define a mock output, and wherever a mock output is defined, that will be used instead of an actual API call via that step. If there is a variable called use mock output set to true in the playbook before any step under consideration. We don't need a Google key. This is just to take the input into another simpler variable. We don't in fact need that as well. And there is a domain reputation initialized. Now let's replace the geolocate domain with our connector. So I'm going to just remove this step. Actually, let's look at if there is anything specific here that we need. Okay, no, nothing. All this is specific to the IP stack integration. So I'm just going to simply remove this step and add my own connector. I'm going to call this step as get domain reputation. Okay, so we haven't yet created a configuration for this connector, so I am not able to use it in the playbooks because it needs at least one configuration. So let's quickly go and configure the connector. Okay, so let's look at our custom connector and give it a config. Okay, so this looks good. Now going back to our playbook. I am going to add the connector step here. the I am taking for the domain. I just need to take the indicator value that came in into the input param. So my step is added. Now there is a decision to see if this domain's reputation was there on the on the endpoint, which is queried by the connector. So it is looking at if the steps status was success or if there was a use mock output true, then yes, it has to go further. So let me just change this to use my new step instead. Now I can use this auto select, or I can simply type the step name separated, this basically all the spaces replaced with underscores. That becomes the name of the step when you refer it in any of the expressions or functions. Okay, so if the step is success, I want to go to creating the information name table. Otherwise, there is no further operation required. I'm going to change the name of the step. It is not IP stack. And once I do that, it will automatically reflect in the condition as well. So let's see what the subsequent step is doing. Let's remove IP stack from here and just call it create information table. This step uses a generic action from the utilities integration, which converts a JSON into an HTML table. So if you notice, it was a REST endpoint that we were querying and the response would be a JSON. But when we want to show that information on the indicator's description, like here, we want to show it more in an HTML styled format. So what I'm going to do here is that using this utilities integration, I'm just going to convert my JSON into an HTML table, an out of the box helper function that lets me do that quickly. It has to use my step result, so I'm going to use it from my output, where's result data. And yeah, the other defaults, I'm going to leave it as is. Save this step. Let's quickly verify that the condition name here also got updated to a new step. That looks perfect. Now, compute IP stack summary. I want to change to compute reputation summary. And again, there is a helper function that is being used here to format a given text as a rich text data. Let's see what this data looks like. Okay, so it has a table, it has a heading called IP stack summary in the look, and then two subheadings, location summary, which is updated with the results obtained from the previous step, and a map location. For my custom integration, I do not have a map location. I need to change this title and this title. So let me go back to the HTML. IP stack summary, I'm going to call my custom summary, and location summary, let me call this domain reputation. Just remove the word summary, and I'm going to remove the last column completely because I do not actually have a map as part of my response. Okay, so we save this step, and let's quickly validate if everything here looks good. The CTI name is actually what is used to display this name here. So, and also in the source data, this name of the key. So let me correct that to my source here as well. And the response that it needs is from the get domain reputation step. And the rest of it looks good. Okay, so one additional field that I want to add from this integration that IP stack does not have is the verdict, because IP stack just provides the domain information, but the document that I was referring to for building pluggable enrichment also mentioned that I could provide a verdict from a value called verdict that will be used towards building the overall verdict for the indicator. So let me build a verdict from, actually before that, I want to show you one more feature that I missed on how these dynamic values, the keys here, right? So as you can see, the output of this step says that in the output you will see two keys called API data and result, which is not the case with my integration, right? When you look at my integration, let me quickly go back to the integration that we built. I think it is still here, yeah. As you can see here, we were returning these keys, reputation, score, and confidence. But when I look at the playbook step in my, when using this connector in my playbook, it says that my response will have API data and result. So why is that? That is because the response for a given step is read from the connector's info.json. And if you look at, if you go back to the operation, the domain reputation operation, there is a key called output schema. This defines what will be the list of keys present in my output. So here it says result and API data, which is from the default template that I had used for all REST-based integrations. And I did not change that, which is why I see these two keys here. So let me quickly correct this to the values that my integration is actually responding with. Score is a number, so I'm just going to give a dummy value here. And I also get a confidence, which is again a number. So this is the correct value for my output schema for this specific operation called get domain reputation. Let's save these changes, publish this connector, and then go back to our playbook that we were writing. And now see if our values reflect correctly. Okay, so now let me go back and add the verdict field. And this is my step, this is my data. Okay, perfect. So I see my keys, the keys that I expect in the response, and some samples that I had defined in the info.json. So the verdict from my integration would be same as what my reputation key here holds. That is how I want the verdict from this specific integration to be. So now let's go ahead and save this playbook. And let me quickly align this cleanly. Okay, so that's all. That's all I need to integrate this into our pluggable enrichment flow. Now let's go back to our Fortinet.com domain indicator that we created, and let's try to refresh its reputation again with and see if our custom integration flow also kicks in. But before that, I need to reset these global variables. Actually, even if I don't reset, when I add a new configuration for any connector, it again checks if it has a playbook for domain reputation, IP reputation, etc. In case I add an integration without any configuration, then I need to just reset this global variable so that my new integration starts counting towards an indicator's enrichment. Now let's, it is the third one in the sequence, get my custom reputation for domain reputation, all those things that we added, right? And then a tabular reputation representation of the JSON that we got as a response. Perfect. There is one thing we noticed though, that this playbook did not return the verdict correctly. So let's see what went wrong with our verdict. Let me just quickly reload this playbook again because it was open in two different tabs. Okay, so our verdict did not get saved. Let me quickly add it again. There we go. And let's actually delete this indicator and create it again and see if our auto enrichment gets triggered correctly. Okay, so the enrichment process has begun and we see our summary and we see it here as well. And let's also see the playbook itself and confirm that it returned everything correctly. Okay, perfect. So we have the verdict this time, the custom enrichment, and the source data enrichment summary. Perfect. So as you can see from these other default enrichments also, right? If you want to, you can return additional things also, like what is the, you can assign a score, an aggregated score to this indicator that can be used to compute a final score for this indicator across all sources. You can have a verdict, you can have an enrichment summary that in an HTML format that gets added in the indicator's description. You can add the raw JSON to the indicator's source data field where an analyst can, so basically the analyst can look at the HTML summary for a quick overview, and then if they want to look at all the important keys, right, or any other attribute in greater detail, they can look at this in the source data. Additionally, you can also update some other fields on the indicator if you wish to through this generic field mapping. If you put any attribute of the indicator, that gets updated accordingly. So that's an example of how you can plug into the default enrichment for indicators. And while building that, we also got a brief introduction to how to understand FortiSOAR playbooks, how to debug FortiSOAR playbooks. We also tried to build a custom connector. And there is one last thing that I wanted to demonstrate through this integration. So you see this expressions library, right? Let me quickly show it here. So this list of functions that come up as a utility functions when you are trying to do a data transformation at any step, right? So for example, you also see utility functions here that can do a JSON to HTML, HTML to JSON and whatnot. And then there are functions specific to these different categories. You want to do data formatting, you want to do some arithmetic, you want to do some date time. So these come as very handy extra functions so that you can use them inline instead of having to add a dedicated step to do the same operation, right? So what if you wanted to expose your domain reputation function, the connector function, as a inline function itself that can be used while you are using some other step, but you just wanted to use that as a data transformation function inline. So just to show you the difference, let me add another playbook to the sample collection, and I will I will try to add the same connector function that we just created in this playbook in two different ways. So one, as we all know, is going to the connector and let's call it method one, and we do get domain reputation. Let me just give it a hard-coded value here, abcd.com, and we use this step to get the reputation of this connector. Now let me go back to my connector and do a quick change to it. So here is my connector. I edit the connector, and in the info.json where this operation is defined, let me just add one more key, which you can see documented on our build your own connector product documentation. So you see this include as function true. Let me show you the how to leverage that basically. So I am adding that to my operation and saying basically to add this operation get domain reputation to be also be available as a function in my playbooks. So that's added. Now I am going back to my playbook where I was adding this connector, and let me just create an indicator. Right now I am not calling the connectors enrichment function explicitly. I am creating an indicator, and here I am creating a, sorry about that, an indicator with value abcd.com, and let's in the description I want to include the reputation directly from my connector. So one way, as you can see, is I have a step added previously that gets the reputation, and I can just get this data and use it here, right? And a shortcut, if I did not want to add that connector step explicitly, you can see that my connector would also be included as a function here. Sorry, not an utility. It got added as a custom integration, and it is available. You will notice that this custom was not available earlier. It only got visible after I added the include as function tag there. Now I can do that the same domain here and say add. So basically I could add, while creating an indicator, I could also add the reputation for that indicator in the same step. I did not need to explicitly create an additional step before that where I get the reputation and then use it in a subsequent step. So wherever you want to expose your helper functions or custom integrations as inline functions, you could just include an include as function tag onto the operation, and that makes the operation available inline. I think that pretty much covers the agenda for this video. Thank you, everyone.